My favorite plant to grow in my yard is the fruit tree, because you plant it once and you get fruit for decades. If you have ever been curious on the best ways to be successful in growing fruit trees, today is your lucky day. Why? Because my team and I have compiled our best interviews and videos in one place to assist you in growing your own toe-tingling peaches and awesome apples right out your front or back door. Plus, as an added bonus, we've included an in-depth guide to successfully growing fruit trees in your yard. To get access to this information, it's free by the way, just go to urbanorchard.org or text FRUIT to 33444. That's urbanorchard.org or text FRUIT to 33444.
You're listening to the Urban Farm Podcast, your partner in the grow your own food revolution. Whether you've just been introduced to urban farming or you're a lifelong advocate, we're sure you'll leave feeling more informed, equipped, and empowered to dig deeper into the soil of your local food economy. With you every step of the way, here's your host, Greg Peterson.
Today on the Urban Farm Podcast, we have Don Tipping of Seven Seeds Farm to talk about his experience with seeds and plant breeding. Don has been offering hands-on practical seed workshops at Seven Seeds Farm since 1997. His farm is a small organic farm in the Siskiyou Mountains of southwest Oregon, situated at 2,000-foot elevation on a 7,000-foot tall forested mountain with rushing spring-fed creeks flowing through the land and nestled among old-growth forests. Don helped found the Siskiyou Sustainable Cooperative, which manages a 300-share CSA, a commercial seed growing operation, and an equipment co-op and internship curriculum among the 12 cooperating farms. He also co-founded the Family Farmers Seed Cooperative, a seed growing, marketing, and distribution cooperative comprised of 10 Western organic farms. He sits on the board of the Rocky Mountain Seed Alliance and is a regular contributor to the Oregon State University Small Farms Education Program. Don is also a charter member of the Open Source Seed Initiative, OSSI, as a plant breeder and seed company advocate. Don is regularly sought out as a teacher, collaborator, and consultant in the Pacific Northwest. Welcome to the show today, Don.
Hi, good morning, Greg. So glad to be here.
And thanks for being here. I'm excited to chat with you. So I shared a bit about you. Can you fill in the blanks for us and share more about the path you took to get to where you're at now?
Yeah, I'd be happy to. Well, going way back, I had the opportunity to run a small CSA farm at a Waldorf school in Davis, California, back in 1995. And at that point, I worked on a number of organic farms, and my relationship with seeds was just something that you opened a package and you poured something out and then you planted it.
Right.
I never really had given it much thought where they came from. And then through that Waldorf School farm experience, I had the opportunity to meet a man named Harold Hoven, who ran a small CSA farm at the Rudolph Steiner College in Fair Oaks, California, and taught biodynamic agriculture. And he had a long-standing relationship with growing seed. And not so much for the kind of self-sufficiency system, but as he put it, it was a way that a farm system could express its individuality. You know, so basically, over time, the plants, through saving seed, are going to become adapted to that climate, the soils, the bugs, the diseases, that sort of thing. And, you know, ultimately be more of a signature of the farm. So that really put the curiosity in my mind around seed, and I've been saving seed ever since. And then when I moved to Oregon in 96, ironically, it was not my intention, but the Applegate Valley here in southern Oregon, which is part of the larger Rogue River Valley, has long been an area where there's been a lot of organic seed growing happening. So I was not only able to meet people that have been doing this for years, but also Seeds of Change, the seed company, really had its start in this area. And I was able to get a couple seed contracts, 2 to be specific, back for the 97 season. I remember we grew lemon cucumbers and a Chinese cabbage. And that's how I got my feet wet with seed saving as a significant part of what we do here on our farm.
Right. Curious, you said a couple of things that I want to kind of touch in on. You used the word farm system to describe a farm. Yeah. Can you say more about that?
There's a number of words that people use to describe this sort of closed loop farm system or whole system. And permaculture is a new buzzword, relatively new buzzword. Biodynamics has always had that view, natural farming. So, and really lately I've been thinking about the old rhyme, Old MacDonald Had a Farm.
Oh, yes.
It's actually kind of a sacred incantation of how a healthy farm should be. And that's, if you ask a child what's on a farm, they're going to say, animals, a barn, plants, a family, those iconic aspects. So that's what makes a farm a system, so that a true, closed loop system, the fertility is coming from within the system. The animals make manure and that fertilizes the crops.
Yeah.
And the crop residues help make compost, and so forth. You can get real complicated. So, seed saving is, I think, an intrinsic part of that. And lately I've been thinking about it that I think in a way seed saving is the defining element of what makes agriculture. Pretty much until we started seed saving, we were hunter-gatherers.
Right.
And then once we started saving the seeds and replanting them, that's when agriculture started.
Yeah.
So it's so ironic that nowadays most farms don't save any seed. They buy it all. And and they don't have any animals, or they don't save any water in ponds or rainwater or swales, that kind of thing. And, I think we see so many efforts within the organic, natural farming community to get back to this Old MacDonald Had a Farm ideal of what is a farm. So.
Wow, cool. And something that hadn't occurred to me, interestingly, was that growing seeds is probably pretty significantly different than growing food.
Yeah, this is true. And that's one thing. We do quite a bit of education here on the farm. We do twice a year a 5-day intensive on seed growing. And a lot of people, because seed is kind of a hot topic right now with GMOs and Monsanto, and, basically seed saving is seen as I hope, the answer to what the GMO mess. But people are all excited to get into it. And one of the things I like to remind folks of is that you have to be really good at growing the crop to maturity. If you're going to grow, Chinese cabbage for seed, you have to be able to grow a head of Chinese cabbage.
Right.
If you want to grow lettuce for seed, you have to be able to grow a good head of lettuce, because the seed part is the next stage. And also, oftentimes when we eat a vegetable or a fruit, in the case of a cucumber or a tomato, we're interrupting the life cycle of that plant, and we're consuming the fruits or the vegetative portion at an immature state. So, like a cauliflower, for instance, when we eat it, it's a suppressed flower bud.
Right.
But when you let it all the way to seed, that plant might get 5 or 6 feet tall and be covered with hundreds, if not thousands, of flowers. And then those flowers get pollinated, and then the plant begins to dry down. And by the time you're harvesting seed, it looks like a weed, like a tumbleweed, like a dry, dead stalk.
Right.
And sometimes when we do farm tours, I'm a little embarrassed of how our fields look, because to the untrained eye, it's not these neat, tidy rows of heads of lettuce or nice, compact, easily recognizable vegetables. They look like, a radish plant for seed looks like a tumbleweed. They're huge. They're like 3 or 4 feet around. And so you have to, it's just a longer cycle. And if the weeds get in there, or it's just you're interacting with the plant for a longer amount of time. And in that, there's a lot of beautiful things that happen, because all of a sudden the pollinators become really important allies, even more so.
Yeah.
and you always have things flowering on the farm. Whereas lettuce, most of us never let our lettuce flower. We eat it as salad. And then it's also providing habitat for all these frogs, snakes, lizards, birds. You know, we have untold amount of songbirds that come in the fall to clean up the seeds that we haven't gotten to, or we're trying desperately to get around to before they eat it.
Right, exactly.
So again, back to that idea of a system, the farm becomes more of an ecology. And that's, I really like that term that I think is used more in other countries than the U.S. of agroecology, and the idea that part of the salvation of what we can do around climate change, carbon farming, really entails seeing agriculture as an ecological system that isn't degrading the earth, but to the contrary, improving the wildlife habitat, the quality of the soil, pollinator habitat, the quality, the nourishment for the human part of the equation. And so, yeah, that whole part, it's just, you kind of have to be a little more invested if you want to say seed, because it's going to take more patience and more perseverance.
And more time.
Yeah. Unless, of course, and this is where I don't like to scare people away, just let things go to seed. You don't even need to know what's going on.
Right.
Just let it go wild, and all of a sudden seeds falling on the ground and then growing back up again, even if you have no clue what you're doing. So there's a beauty in that too. You can choose your own adventure, so to speak.
Nice. So you run 7 Seeds Farm and Siskiyou Seeds, and you do education around that. Tell us about all the great stuff that you do underneath the umbrella of all of that.
Yeah, as a lot of farms, it's kind of evolved over the years, but here at 7 Seeds Farm, we have 40 acres of land, of which we're tending about 12 acres. And of that, we have about 5 acres in annuals, most of which is for seed production. The rest of it is just our own subsistence homestead. And then we have about 3 acres of fruit trees, and we sell that at a farmer's market. And also I started at a cooperative CSA with some other farmers about 14 years ago. So we deliver food to about 300 families for the season. And we also work with the senior centers locally to supply organic produce there, and also the hospital workers at the 2 hospitals nearby. We supply organic produce to them as part of their benefit. We keep sheep, goats, and poultry as well here, but that's kind of more just for our own homestead use.
Yeah. Well, and the manure that goes behind them, yes?
Yeah, totally.
Yeah, cool.
Yeah.
So tell me about the Siskiyou Sustainable Cooperative, and you use the initial CSA. Now, while most of our listeners might know what that is, would you just kind of explain what a CSA is and what you're doing there? Yeah.
So basically, a CSA, Community Supported Agriculture, is what that stands for, is a subscription-based approach to delivering and marketing produce. So, we saw that in our area, the farmers markets, there's a bit of an erratic nature. If let's say you're a farmer and you sell there, you could have, good business, good sales, and then all of a sudden maybe a couple new farms begin selling, and maybe they're selling the same things as you. So it's difficult to develop customer loyalty in that, even though that does happen at the market. Where the beauty of the CSA is we're entering a relationship with the customers who are agreeing upfront to support us for the season, and in turn, we're providing them, produce once a week, and they get some say in the diversity and quantity in that, and they get a better value as well. So for us, you can get just a basic, produce box of a, mini, small, or large size, but we also have eggs, flours, milk, a couple different kinds of meat, bread, local brick oven bakery.
Oh, nice.
And we used to even do fresh roasted coffee. So you add these options on to really make it more of a whole diet CSA.
Yeah.
And And we've had a lot of people that stuck with us for years. I mean, like I said, we've been doing this for 14 years, and it works out pretty well. So
nice. So, and you actually put together a cooperative of farmers to make that happen.
Yeah.
That's
so
cool.
You can imagine there's a lot of administration to something like this, all the communication with each of those 300 clients and all of the specialty things. So the way we've done it is there's one family that has a farm that runs the CSA. They do all of that, and they get paid to administer that. And then as growers, we sell our produce in at 75% of retail. Mm-hmm. So you can compare that with, if you're wholesaling, it's about 60%. Mm-hmm. So we get a little better price, but we also own the company. It's a cooperative.
Right.
So we have a say in how we do business. And then theoretically, if there's extra money left over at the end of the year, we decide if we're going to distribute it amongst ourselves, or oftentimes we'll invest in, like we own a refrigerated produce truck, or, we'll do some capital improvement for our business.
Wow,
so.
How cool is that? And to top that all off, you've got the Family Farmers Seed Cooperative. So that's a cooperative that's growing seed.
Exactly. Yeah. And, any farm that really wants, I think, long-term resilience, mm-hmm. wherever they are, you want to have different, eggs in your basket.
Right.
Or, don't put all your eggs in the same basket. So a lot of these growers that grow produce also have some fruit trees and do some seed production. So we've found that because so many of us were growing seed, we actually started as an offshoot of the CSA co-op, a equipment sharing co-op, where we have a few pieces of seed cleaning and harvesting equipment that we share amongst mm-hmm. ourselves. Mm-hmm. And then we began to, see that this little model that we had of collaboration and sharing was something that may benefit others who maybe are in regions where there aren't so many other growers growing seed.
Right.
So the Family Farmers Seed Co-op started back in 2008, and they're growers in Colorado, New Mexico, Washington, North Dakota, Idaho, Oregon, and California. I think that's it.
Wow.
Some of those growers are just out, like our friends in North Dakota, and there's not many other organic growers. So by participating in this, it gives them access to markets and, advertising and technical support that perhaps they wouldn't have otherwise. And, the ultimate vision is what we want to see is these bioregional seed hubs in different regions where people are breeding organic seed crops, producing the seed, educating, sharing equipment, making it available for everybody from the garden scale to the homestead scale to the farm scale, so that we have ultimately resilience in our food systems.
Right.
Because right now we have a system where most organic farms are buying all their seed, and it's coming oftentimes from who knows where, maybe even overseas, China. It's not a very stable system. So, we got to just start small. In permaculture, we say develop a nucleus and radiate outwards.
Yep.
So, and I would say we're still working on that. It's, you can't fix, decades worth of a broken system.
Right.
And, one fell swoop, but.
Right. Well, I've always say that, people, they say to me, Greg, you're that guy that lives in that totally sustainable house in North Central Phoenix. And I've always viewed what I do as a process, not a destination. Because I don't know that my house could ever be totally sustainable. Hey, I still drive a car. I still wear clothes, so on and so on. So for me, it's become a journey of the journey rather than a journey of the destination. And it sounds like, you guys are making great headway doing the same thing with both your cooperatives.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And that's, I think in time, we're moving to a culture of access versus ownership. And this idea of self-sufficiency is perhaps missing the mark. And what we really want is like community interdependence, community reliance. So, and that's something, we have solar panels and a hydro system here and try and grow a lot of our own food, but I realize you can't be an expert at everything. And there is a place for the specialists and to cultivate relationships with other people who, and that, like I found, I want to do all sorts of things, but seeds are sort of my gig. So I'm going to just do a really good job with that and try and build trusting, supportive relationships with others, and basically say, hey, I'll have your back on seed, and hopefully you've got mine on some other things, and together we'll do pretty good.
Yeah, exactly. Well, and the bottom line is, and you kind of inferred this along the way, without seeds there's not much else.
Yeah. And that's one of the things. Recently we did a Indiegogo fundraiser to help with our seed company, sort of some capital improvements. And one of the things is I really thought about, like, well, okay, what's the elevator speech about all this thing to somebody that doesn't know anything about farming, gardening, or seeds? And I thought about it. I'm like, okay, what are the most important ingredients for human civilization? Obviously you've got people, right, but also air, water, soil to grow your food, and seeds, because most of us still eat a diet composed mostly of annuals that require being planted every year.
Yeah.
We're not eating chestnuts and, acorns and stuff quite yet. So, and again, like, how to articulate that in a way that's not about self-importance. It's like, well, this is just something common to all people, something we all share in common, that seeds are important. And I think it's interesting that we have this whole, Monsanto kind of almost Star Wars good and evil epic playing out in these times, as people are trying to, consolidate this, and these are ultimately, I feel like it's kind of like the story of Robin Hood, that some things just always belong in the commons. Air. No one can own the air. Water. We try and own the soil, or the ground, but even then you think there's zoning, codes, laws, all that kind of stuff. Mm-hmm. And the same with seeds. Seeds should be, have always been freely exchanged. And even if we create laws, I could still walk into some field, gather some seeds, take them and plant them. Nature has its own rules.
Right.
And, I think we just, how do we bring the discourse around this to a higher level? And I really admire folks like Vandana Shiva, who are helping us relearn, what does the commons mean? Yeah. What does sharing really mean? And, and it runs so counter to so many of those things around private property that we as Americans in particular, we put this on such high esteem. And I'm not meaning to undermine that for anybody and dilute it, but seeds move around, birds move them around, and animals are constantly moving seeds around. We can think of burrs and stuff like that. It's just how nature works. So, I think we're in a fascinating time in human history where, things that we assumed are all of a sudden having to be discussed and come to new agreements about.
Yeah. So, speaking to that, the Open Source Seed Initiative, or OSSI, can you say a little bit about that?
Yeah. So, we realized, again, just to give a nod to, some of the problems that we faced with the control of seeds and the intellectual property around it. I've been involved in a number of lawsuits and different things around fighting GMO crops being released. And we realized fighting that paradigm isn't really useful or effective. They've already invested so much in all the attorneys and the public relations firms and the utility patents and all that stuff. So how can we, as a community of plant breeders, and really that's the Open Source Seed Initiative was started by plant breeders at the public land grant colleges in Oregon, which is OSU, Washington, which is WSU, Wisconsin State, and Cornell University in New York.
Wow.
Basically getting together and saying, how can we develop a understanding around material that we develop as plant breeders that we are putting it in the commons. And the term we used to use for this was public domain, that we would put it in the public domain instead of patenting it or controlling it in the private. Mm-hmm. And so with the proliferation of open source software, folks realized, like, well, maybe that's a way that we could understand it, that these are open source seeds. And so everybody in the open source seed initiative who's part of it, whether it's a plant breeder or a seed company, is pledging, it's just a voluntary pledge of saying, I agree that I'm, putting these seeds, this variety that I bred, into an open source arrangement. Anybody can obtain these seeds, grow them, and save seeds. And we encourage them to credit the breeder if they're willing to, but there's not a requirement around that. So it's really a good faith effort.
Yeah.
And the idea is if we get enough momentum and enough people participating in this, we actually create a whole new paradigm around this. To the extent that it's legally defensible, I don't know. Hopefully we never have to test that. But one of the little things that happened was there's a plant breeder at Oregon State named Jim Myers, who's been involved in the organic community for quite a number of years. And he created a broccoli, an open pollinated broccoli that he was planning on just releasing to the public. They weren't going to patent it or anything like this. And it had this unique characteristic of the head was above the foliage. He calls it the exerted head trait. So in a large scale, you could come along with a machine and cut those heads more easily without getting a lot of leaves stuck in the mix.
Right.
Well, as it turns out, Syngenta somehow obtained some seed, grew it out, and then patented that trait as their own creation.
Oh, geez.
And, well, they didn't create it for one. Jim Myers created it to put it in the commons. And then they took it and said, we invented it. And, and basically they've dropped that because they got publicly humiliated about it. But the Seed Initiative is trying to avoid situations like that.
Yeah.
You can't pledge a variety that you didn't breed. So I can't take an heirloom, let's say, like I was just in New Mexico for a conference. Uh-huh. I can't take some heirloom indigenous corn from a Pueblo tribe and pledge it to the open source seed initiative saying I bred this, because I didn't. So, you need, it's a bit of a kind of an honor system around that, but there is a review board around that because we want to avoid, that kind of biopiracy trait. So, yeah.
Biopiracy. Say a little bit about that, and then I'm going to shift on you.
Yeah. So, basically with that is the idea that there's this indigenous wealth that's been created over the centuries. Gary Nabham said in his book, Where Our Food Comes From, that 99% of the improvement of our vegetable varieties was completed 300 years ago.
Oh, wow.
And then what we've done in the modern era amounts to less than 1%. Because you think about it, we took basically weeds and turned them into corn, peppers, melons, eggplants, vast improvement. So the idea that, these biotech companies can go into predominantly developing countries and identify traits and patent them as their own novel inventions. And this is taking place. They're patenting concepts like red in lettuce or heat tolerance or something, and saying they invented that when actually it was just an inherent trait to a landrace variety. Yeah. So, again, open source seed initiative is, we can't stop that. That's a giant thing. We've already tried. It's a legal, wormhole. So what can we start to begin to start a new idea that makes more sense and is actually more feasible over the long term. So
cool. So can you talk about a time you failed, how you overcame that failure, and what you might have learned from it?
Yeah, well, there's a lot. I mean, I think embracing working with seeds or farming in general is you just have to kind of romance failure. And one of my mentors, Jim Leap, who was a farm manager at the University of California, Santa Cruz farm, he said a good approach is to cut your expected yields in half and double your expected expenses. And if you hit that 1/4 of your goal, you're doing great.
Yeah.
And that's a kind of a sad Murphy's Law approach to life. But, I think some of the things, because nobody ever really taught me how to do this, there wasn't really a school you could go to learn seed growing or plant breeding.
Right.
And then if we're excited about things, we just get into it and we just start doing it. So like one of the things I did once is I started really getting into growing onion seed, which is a biennial. So First you grow the onions, you dig them up, sort them, replant them, and then they go over the winter and then flower and make seed in the next year. So it's about 18-month life cycle.
Wow.
Well, in my excitement about this, I started working on this project of very detailed plant breeding of, growing thousands of onions and then selecting to the maybe 1,000 bulbs that were the best and replanting those. And then I'd save seed. Well, and then what I did is I started, let's say this was 2008 that I started seed for some of these. Then in 2009, I started another one. And I realized I had 2 breeding projects that were leapfrogging one another, never communicating because they were in alternate years.
Right.
And just, it stopped to think about it long enough to oh, that's dumb. Now I'm created 2 projects where I should have just done 1. So there's things like that. Another one, this one's a little more simple, is I started working with a large organic produce grower in my area because I realized, okay, Steve's growing 100 acres of organic veggies. He's buying a lot of seed. Maybe we could collaborate. I could find out what he likes or doesn't like about what's out there, and we can save some in his field. So we had a bed of collards. It was about 1,000 feet long, big, a lot of collards, and it was bolting. It was beginning to flower, and it was about 6-7 feet tall.
Wow.
And I was talking to Steve, and we're in a 40-acre field of vegetables, which is a lot of space. That's a 1/4 mile on a side. You kind of need a truck or an ATV to get around. It's too far to walk. And I said, Steve, do you have any other Brassica oleracea species here? And he's like, Brassica what? He's like, my wife buys all the seed. You'll have to talk to her. But I don't think so. And I realized, that's where most produce growers are at.
Right.
They're just
buying seeds.
They're just chasing the tiger's tail, right. Just trying to keep the bills paid and all that. So, I asked Susie and she's like, no, I don't think so. His wife. And then, I was driving in a different part of the field one day, and I noticed this huge hedge of yellow flowers.
Uh-oh.
And I was like, wow, what's that? So I drove over to it, and I looked down, and it was kohlrabi. Just some neglected partial bed they forgot about. And, most farmers don't know that collards and kohlrabi are actually the same species, right, even though they look so different. So all of a sudden I was like, oh, no, Steve, and again, it's not my farm. I'm just collaborating. I can't just jump on a tractor and mow down the kohlrabi. And, again, it's all Latino men on the field, and they're like, well, you'll have to find Steve, and so there's this panic moment of God, how long have these been flowering? Did I just allow them to cross? And,
right,
is this all this work going for nothing? And, and these kind of things happen. And I just, we moved forward. We managed to get that mowed down. We saved the seeds of the collard, and they're pretty good. You can't see any weirdness in there.
Right.
But had it been, collards, again, we just eat the leaves. So a little bit of kohlrabi in there is not that big a deal. Yeah. If it had been the other way around, it could have been disastrous. Yeah. So
I did that.
We're always just flirting with that kind of that edge.
Yeah.
Well, just to finish that idea is what we're doing in horticulture is we're trying to maintain all this control.
Yeah.
Where nature wants to have a big, just orgy and everything get all crossed up, and we just, it wouldn't be all the diversity that we celebrate. Yeah. So
I did that once with beets and Swiss chard, grew them next to each other.
Oh yeah.
Let one of them go to seed and save the seeds, and well, that was pretty much the end of the beets.
Yeah.
So what do you consider your biggest success?
For me, one of the things I've been thinking about, it's really easy to get focused on, all the minutia of what we do.
Yeah.
But I realize everything that we're doing on this farm is ultimately for the people. we can say, oh, we're improving wildlife habitat or pollinator habitat, or we're improving our soil, or we're really, trying to grow soil. But really, it's all for our own ideas. For one, we're growing food that's feeding people.
Yeah.
Or growing seeds that people are going to plant to grow food, to grow more people. Or even the more conceptual things like flowers. It's really for our own enjoyment and aesthetic, appreciation. So, and then I think about that in terms of the young people on the farm. We do internships and different trainings, and we're cultivating. And Fukuoka had a great quote to that extent, that said the ultimate goal of agriculture isn't the growing of crops, but the cultivation of the human potential.
Yeah.
And so that's one of the things I look at more and more is, we've been doing internships for 19 years here. And to see the people, some have gone on to start farms or even seed companies. Others have gone on to start families. And, they were inspired about having kids through this experience of living on our farm. And those relationships, and that we're ultimately inspiring people to develop relationships with nature to improve the quality of their life and their happiness. Yeah. Like at the end of the day, that's, when we're all on our deathbed, I think that's the types of things we reflect fondly on. So I'm trying more and more, while staying scientific and detail-oriented with the business part, to remember that it's about this cultivation of the, human consciousness ultimately. Yeah. And somehow trying to, and that's where I think seeds are a really, I never thought about this at the onset. It just was like, oh, seeds are cool. I'll do that. But that it's actually this really profound metaphor that poets throughout the ages have used to describe all sorts of things. And then, I talk about that here on the farm, that we're actually literally working with all this potential. And, and I think, as we move seeds around and consolidate a whole field of kale or something down into a 5-gallon bucket of seeds, and just the potential that is inherent in that is something that gives me a lot of satisfaction. And more than my own satisfaction is sharing that with others and seeing them light up with just feeling that. They don't even have to know it. Like kids can plunge their hands into a bin of seeds, and you feel the joy emanating from them as they can't articulate what's going on. But so to me that part's just so awesome. Yeah. And I just want to see more people have those kind of experiences in their life, because that's kind of what it's about, increasing life.
Right. Beautiful. So along those same lines, what drives you?
That's a good question. When I teach, one of the little sayings I picked up from permaculture is that if you love what you do, you'll never work another day in your life. Yeah. And there's a lot of jobs that happen here that aren't really that fun, just whatever it is. Yeah. Cleaning out the goat barn or something. But I think one of the things I think about sometimes when I'm in these moments of maybe it's feeling a little monotonous or I'm having a hard time motivating is just remembering that if I can take an attitude that really what I'm doing here is I'm not the like if this was an orchestra, I'm not the soloist. I'm not the lead first chair violin player. That's a tree or an animal or a field of a plant, or things I have no control over, the dragonflies that come to the pond. I'm really just sometimes I get to be the conductor, and then other times I'm the instrument repairman. Oh, this one's out of tune, I gotta tune it up. But for it to get to that beautiful symphony when everything's working right entails that ultimately we're leading from behind. And we have to kind of just get in there and see that it's about the union of all of these elements that make a system where it's beautiful, and there's a certain magical dynamo aspect to it that it's just running itself. Yeah. And really a lot of it's so simple. A child could learn how to do most of what I do here, but it's knowing the right thing to do at the right time. Yeah. So, that part, it's just a perpetual challenge, and that's one of the things I like to share, is that I feel like farming is like climbing a mountain that you'll never reach the summit of. You'll never
right.
You'll never graduate. You'll never completely figure it out, because the climate will change. There'll be new bugs. Something will be different.
Yeah.
And you just have to recognize when there's a plateau to turn around and just take in the view and just breathe in, gratitude for just the opportunity to do something like that. And just know, like, well, that's part of what being alive is about. Yeah. It's just you're enjoying the process. And if you're product oriented, like there's a farmer that he was from Switzerland, and he said the day he looked out at his field of lettuce and he saw heads of lettuce as dollar bills, he knew he needed to stop farming. If you're always deducing it down to this, linear, quantifiable aspect, then you're sort of losing the magic of what it is why you do that. So, for me, that's why the plant breeding is really cool, because it's kind of like being an artist. You're creating new things, and I sometimes use the analogy of when you breed plants, you're like a singer-songwriter that's writing their own material. Right. When you just get seeds out of a envelope and plant them, you're kind of like a cover band playing cover songs. And then, you can make it sound good, right? But it's not the same really thing. You. So that part's been, just how to find the creative expression as I get older, just more fulfilling. Right. Yeah.
So do you have one or two books that have been influential for you in this process in your life?
Well, I mentioned the one earlier from Gary Paul Nabhan.
Yep.
Of native seeds fame, which, I know he's down in your neck of the woods in Tucson. Yep. He wrote a book called Where Our Food Comes From. Mm-hmm. And in that, he retraces the steps of Nikolai Vavilov, who was a Russian botanist who saw starvation and famine as a major problem back in the early 1900s. And in 1910, he had developed the world's largest seed collection. Wow. Traveling all over the world with, donkeys, and, you can imagine the technology and what it took to get up into the Andean highlands to gather rare peppers. Right. Yeah. I mean, he had quinoa back in 1905, So that's fascinating, just to learn, where did all this stuff come from? And these were people that weren't scientists developing all these varieties. So that just is a good humbling book to realize that what's been done and how you can make a contribution. Yeah. Even if you don't know what you're doing. So that then another one would be a book called Return to Resistance by Raoul Robinson, and that one it's basically a plant breeding book, but it has a lot of story in it, and over the 40 years of his career, he traveled around the world and again was looking at problems that were affecting the food supply. Some blight on a potato in Africa and as a primary staple crop. So he would go in and try and do low-tech plant breeding with the community to help them improve their crops. So this is where the idea of horizontal resistance and plant breeding was developed. And what a lot of us in the organic camp are doing is best articulated in this book. And I know it's back in print now. It went out of print, but it's just a fantastic tale that again looks at the global situation in agriculture in a positive way and what we can do about it.
Yeah, I'm on Amazon right now, and there are plenty of copies out there. Return to Resistance, Breeding Crops to Reduce Pesticide Dependence.
Yeah.
Nice.
And that's, to me, a fascinating thing is this idea that we can actually breed plants to resist pests and diseases. Mm-hmm. So, and that's one of the things I say, well, you can change the environment outside the crop, with row covers, greenhouses, sprays, picking off bugs, or you can change the crop from the inside, which over the long term is a better route. It's harder, but really when you look at all the things you don't have to buy to grow crops, then I think it's a better way to go about it.
Yeah. Beautiful. What one final piece of advice do you have for our listeners?
Well, I would, just encourage everybody to, again, start small and harvest small mistakes. So if you want to get in, don't let all of the details and Latin botanical names and all that dissuade you from getting into it. Just, let some lettuce go to seed, or let some of your bush beans go to seed, and save them and plant them, and do it with your kids, and just, let the journey, the miracle of the journey pull you along, rather than be scared off by the length of the distance. Like Lao Tzu said, the journey of 1,000 miles starts with the first step.
Yeah.
So, and I think that I know that's been what's been happening in my life. So.
Mm-hmm. Well, thank you so much for joining us on the show and sharing your experience with us today, Don. It has been a treat getting to chat with you.
Thank you very much. I've enjoyed it too.
Absolutely. So one thing we didn't touch on that I want to know about your courses. Tell us about your courses, how people find out about them, how people take them.
Okay. Yeah. Well, years ago, the Organic Seed Alliance used to offer a 5-day class called Fundamentals of Plant Improvement, and they kind of changed their approach and stopped doing that. And then Bill McDorman, too, he's right about that same time, he started the seed school.
Right.
And I thought that was so cool. So I actually called up Bill McDorman. I said, hey, what do you think of me doing a seed school? And he said, great idea. Go for it.
Yeah.
So his wife, Belle, suggested I call it something different just to identify, because it is a bit of a different thing. We do a 5-day intensive here on our farm called the Seed Academy twice a year.
Nice.
So once in May, and the upcoming one is May 3rd through the 7th. So people come and we feed them here. They camp out or stay nearby. And it's we explore botany, reproductive biology, plant breeding, selection, seed cleaning. And we do it spring and fall so that we can look at those two windows.
Right.
So obviously the fall one is more about seed cleaning and seed harvest, and the spring one is more like plant breeding and how do plants pollinate and that kind of stuff. And then I bring in other experts, like Bill McDorman's come in, my friend Rowan White, Andrew Still and Sarah Klieger, the local plant breeder Jonathan Spiro, and then we go on field trips to other farms that grow seed who are also members of our CSA, who also employ a lot of permaculture. So it's really a great opportunity to learn what people who call and ask about it. I say, this is going to be a permaculture class, but it's going to be all about seeds. And you're going to learn all about permaculture through the lens of seeds, of how does a whole system work. And then once you understand how systems work, it's just like an equation. You apply it to anything. And and your own curiosity will pull you along. So we call it the Seed Academy, from the Greek, academy that was a temple to Athena,
right?
Which is, about skill and knowledge. So just want to get this knowledge out there. And what's been cool for me is that a number of the graduates of this program have gone on to grow seed for Siskiyou Seeds.
Oh, nice.
So not only am I improving our knowledge, I'm getting, building our team.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
So, and it sounds to me like the fall one is different than the spring one. So one could take both academies.
Exactly. Yeah. And I give folks a discount if they sign up for both. And we have scholarships available. And I try and really make it. The last one we did, we had people that represented, I think, 5 or 6 different countries, and urban to rural. And then in that, we create a community of people that hopefully will, carry forward as these seed Jedis in the future.
Yeah. Beautiful. Well, thank you so much for doing that. This is such important work.
Great. Yeah, you're welcome.
How can our listeners get a hold of you, find out more about your courses, and so on?
Yeah. So we have a website for the farm, which is just 7seedsfarm.com. And that's where we advertise all our classes. And then we also have how-to tips on there. Mm-hmm. And then our seed website is siskiyouseeds.com, and that's where you can buy seeds and find out other information as well.
Perfect. You can also find show notes from today's podcast at urbanfarm.org/7seeds. Well, that's it for today. Thanks for joining us on the Urban Farm Podcast.
Great, thanks.
My favorite plant to grow in my yard is the fruit tree, because you plant it once and you get fruit for decades. If you have ever been curious on the best ways to be successful in growing fruit trees, today is your lucky day. Why? Because my team and I have compiled our best interviews and videos in one place to assist you in growing your own toe-tingling peaches and awesome apples right out your front or back door. Plus, as an added bonus, we've included an in-depth guide to successfully growing fruit trees in your yard. To get access to this information, it's free, by the way. Just go to urbanorchard.org or text FRUIT to 33444. That's urbanorchard.org or text FRUIT to 33444.
We hope you enjoyed today's episode of the Urban Farm Podcast. Remember to listen 3 days a week for tips, advice, and resources to help you on your journey with urban farming. You can find us on the web at urbanfarm.org or send us an email to podcast@urbanfarm.org. In the words of Vincent van Gogh, great things are done by a series of small things brought together. Be encouraged that with each lesson learned and skill developed, you are one step closer in the direction of your dreams.